We have some great speakers for you to listen to today and ask questions. There is obviously one thing that I'd like to do first and foremost, just bear with me 1 second. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Canberra people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people free today as well. Thank you. As you all know, Kylea Tink is our local independent candidate for the federal elections, and we're joined today by Behyad Jafari from the Electric Vehicle Council, Dr. Gabrielle Kuiper from Consultant to Smart Energy Council, and Alec Wonhas from the Energy Corporation as well. Apologies for that. So it's a great pleasure that I brought welcome these people to the stage today. This for me is a bit of a combination of my two work worlds. So prior to owning this bar, I was the head of parking services in Westminster in London. And the last thing I worked on before coming over to Australia 4 years ago was introducing an electric vehicle charging infrastructure onto the streets of London. So if you look at London today, it's quite a different place. So London today is quite a different place to what it was 10 years ago. And you will see an electric vehicle charging points on almost every single street in London. And I think that is a huge achievement, something I'm personally very proud of to be part of in those very early stages. It certainly doesn't come without its complications, and I'm sure as we here in Australia know, we're very early, at the very early stages of the electric vehicle journey. So I'd like to welcome Kylea now, and I'll hand over the microphone, and I do hope that you have a pleasurable afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kieran. As Kieran said, my name is Kylea Tink, and I am running as the independent candidate for the federal seat of North Sydney at the upcoming election. I'm not a politician. I can honestly say, in fact, politics was not a career that I saw myself moving into. What I am is an advocate. For 35 years, I've fought for all sorts of communities, from families experiencing breast cancer through to children going through a cancer diagnosis, for children held in immigration detention centres offshore, through to most recently advocating for vulnerable young Australians who are doing it really tough. And I live locally. I have been a North Sydney resident for over 15 years now, and when I'm not doing all the advocating, I have 3 incredible kids who keep me very much on my toes. So a 19-year-old son, a 17-year-old daughter, and a 14-year-old daughter. And I mention them now because actually it's fundamentally true that one of the reasons that I said yes when a community group called North Sydney's Independent rang and asked if I would consider entering politics was because of them. Because when I look at young Australians, I feel a very real sense of responsibility in terms of handing something over to them and being part of the process of building a better and more optimistic future. I just would like to say one of the most amazing things. So I've now been campaigning for 33 weeks. This is 33 weeks for me since I was announced. And during that time, I've spent the 6 months going right around our community to meet as many people as I possibly could. So residents, as well as incredible experts that we have living right here amongst us. And we literally are an amazing community. And when you find gems like Kieran, I don't hands up those who are actually locals. This is a great gin bar, isn't it? Seriously. But then you meet Kieran and you find out that there is a whole history there and a whole world of intellectual capacity that has already navigated this transition for another major city. And yet, Sydney is still to move in this direction. One more piece of information about me, and it might explain to you why this particular topic, which I see as a discussion around vehicle emissions and fuel efficiency and climate in both our country and our community, is that I am a mechanic's daughter. So I was originally born in a small town of Kuiper out in northwest New South Wales, and right through till today, my dad still works on cars. I was very lucky as a 16-year-old to buy my first car for $500. It was a 1969 Toyota Corolla Sprinter. And I rebuilt that from the ground up with my dad. It's one of my fondest experiences with my dad. What I find fascinating about our country is that that Corolla Sprinter is actually still on the road today, driving on the same petrol that it was driving on when it was first launched in 1969, and emitting the same level of emissions that it would have been emitting when it was first brought in. So we know from all of the work that has been done to date that pretty much the number one issue that is constantly raised by the people of North Sydney when they're asked about what they want to see faster action on is climate. Our community wants to see how it is that our economy can be re-geared to be forward-focused and optimistic, how we can bring integrity back into federal politics and the way that decisions are made, and how we can fundamentally address the systemic inequality that exists within our country. So I am very grateful today to have our incredible speakers with us, and I'm just going to give you a little bit more background on them. So I have got Behyad Jafari sitting immediately to my right here, and please excuse me while I read this because actually I couldn't memorise this in time. They're too amazing. So Behyad founded and leads the Electric Vehicle Council, the national body representing the electric vehicle industry in Australia, to promote and guide industry investment, development and advocacy of public policy by providing research and analysis to fill knowledge gaps in the Australian market. Behyad is also on an advisory board for the ARC Research Hub for Integrated Energy Storage Solutions at University of New South Wales. Please join me in welcoming Behyad. Sitting next to Behyad, we then have Gabrielle. Gabrielle Kuiper is the anglicised version, but it is Kuiper. Is an energy, sustainability and climate change professional with over 20 years experience in the corporate world, government and non-government organisations and academia. She specialises in distributed energy resources and was previously the Distributed Energy Resources Strategy Specialist with the Energy Security Board. Prior to that, Dr. Kuiper held senior executive and senior advisory energy-related positions in the Office of the Australian Prime Minister during the time of PM Julia Gillard, and at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre and in the New South Wales Government. Please join me in welcoming Gabrielle. And then to Gabrielle's right, we have Alex Wonhas. Is one of Australia's leading energy experts and passionate about enabling a smooth energy transition for Australia. As EGM System Design at the Australian Energy Market Operator, which is the AEMO that we often hear referred to, Alex oversaw the development of the most recent Integrated System Plan, Australia's blueprint for the energy transition. Prior to his role at AEMO, Alex held a number of senior executive roles, including at the CSIRO, where he initiated the first National Outlook, which provides a comprehensive plan for Australia to thrive in a low-carbon future. Alex has overseen the establishment of a number of new companies enabling the energy transition. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from the University of Cambridge and lives with his wife and 2 children in Lane Cove. Please join me in welcoming Alex. So as you can see, we literally do have 3 of the brightest minds in this space sitting in front of us today. And so what I would like to do, I'm going to start the discussion today by posing some questions to these guys and asking them to respond. But I'm very eager to get to an open floor, because I think one of the things that re-engaging in this process of participatory democracy allows is for people other than the major parties to be heard. And I would really love to hear today from you on the things that are important to you and to hear what questions you would ask these guys when given the opportunity. So Behyad, because you're on my right, I'd like to start talking with you specifically about electric vehicles. So electric vehicles are no longer a new technology. It would be inappropriate to describe them as that. But the reality remains that Australia is significantly off the pace in terms of managing a transition. The UK brought in their Climate Act in 2008, and in the time since they've adopted that act, they've actually reduced their emissions by 28%. I know a big part of that act was actually legislating around vehicle fuel emission standards and setting clear targets for the introduction of EVs into their market. Can we start by having a discussion around what it is that have been the most significant barriers to getting electric vehicles into Australia, and what it is that you're seeing in terms of actual market trends? Because obviously it's not that long ago that we had a Prime Minister who told us that we can't have electric vehicles in Australia because they'd ruin the Australian weekend. So over to you.
Certainly, and thanks a lot for inviting me to be here, and it's really great to be here at a gin bar. Good to know what lies ahead of me after I'm done with electric vehicles, Kieran. A competing whiskey bar across the road. Watch out for that one. So look, also really great to have that introduction from you of what it is that you were doing in the UK, and looking at a city like London and thinking, well, all of the parking spaces are places where cars spend a lot of time not being driven. So how can we use that time charging? And that gets us to where some of these barriers are and where the market is in Australia. So spitting out the very simple numbers for all of you, in Australia, when people were looking to buy a new car last year, about 2% of them had access to an electric vehicle. That's not how many people wanted to buy an electric vehicle, that's how many there were available for people to buy. That's about 20,665. I'll have to say about and then give an exact number. 20,665 people were able to buy an electric vehicle last year. If we compare that to a market like the UK, where Kieran just was, about 20% of people were able to buy an electric vehicle. Pretty consistent with places France, Germany, California, Canada, most of these good developed countries at around 20%. So 2 to 20%, they can sort of sound like ballpark numbers, right? You can tell that we're quite a far way behind the rest of them, but what does that end up meaning for that broader ecosystem? Because just thinking about car sales is pretty straightforward. Well, who cares about car dealers or whatever else if that's not what you're interested in? But you think behind that lies the entire ecosystem of that our transport system sits within. So the amount of people responsible for and investing in charging stations like Kieran was doing. If you have 2% of the market versus 20% of the market, how much more effort goes into making sure that everyone has access to an electric vehicle charger? Other products like taxis and ride sharing, how many people are investing in new solutions there? I lead an organisation that represents people from banks, software companies, professional services firms. All of these people together are what actually create our transport ecosystem, not just people who buy and sell cars or buy and sell buses. So when we look at those barriers, what we've had in every other country since about 2009, 2010 now, has been a national plan to say this new technology has come onto the market. As we know with new technologies, it's only going to continue to improve, get cheaper and grow. So how can we beat a path for ourselves to actually accelerate that adoption, make sure we get all of the right investments in place so that we have an end date where we no longer sell fossil fuel powered vehicles. What we haven't had in Australia is that very same plan. So the exact same things that have worked here with things like rooftop solar panels, that have worked overseas with things like electric vehicle chargers, haven't been in place. And we see now that we have a market that's about 1/10 the size proportionally to other markets around the world. So we can both see where we are, where those challenges are, but the really good news, and why I stay in my job and I don't give it up, is we know exactly what we need to do in order to solve it as well. We're not an organisation that is scratching our heads about what the evidence or what the solutions or what the research around these issues is. It's really just trying to find the political will to get on with it so that we can catch up at least to where the rest of the world is.
Behyad, can I just pick up on something that you've said? And I think it's your point that in other markets we're seeing up to 20% adoption of electric vehicles. There is, my understanding, there is the consumer side of this equation, but there is actually the manufacturers themselves and the incentives that they have to direct the vehicles that they develop to different markets. Can we just talk a little bit about it here in this room, about why it is that the manufacturers aren't prioritising the Australian marketplace?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to illustrate that, I started by saying that only 2% of people were able to buy an electric vehicle. And why do I say that? We look at some of the very popular models. There's two that I'll point out for you now, the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and the Kia EV6. Both of those came to the Australian market and sold out within 1 hour, as soon as they were made available online for Australians.
1 hour.
Now, why did they sell out within an hour? These two global companies decided to give us about 500 each of those cars. And what they found is that there were about 15,000 people lined up in a waiting list to buy those vehicles. So you had 500 vehicles, 15,000 people looking to buy them, still sitting on a waiting list, waiting for an electric vehicle to come and be made available to them. So you would think, if you're running a business, great, let's send 15,000 more, right? Why isn't that piece happening? For a very good reason. There are production lines building electric vehicles right now. That same company, it's not an Australian company, it's a global one, it decides where to sell those vehicles. And this is, I'm not letting you into any trade secrets here, these companies tell us very clearly, and very, very plainly, that in every other developed country in the world, bar Australia and Russia, if we do not sell electric vehicles, we are up for penalties. And these are penalties in Europe, for instance, that range up to about $15,000. So we need to take and invest more in things like charging and consumer education, and yes, the vehicles themselves, to sell them into those markets. Selling electric vehicles to the Australian market is just a nice to have. And by the way, it's a nice to have that puts us on the hook for $15,000 somewhere else. So actually, it's costing us money globally to bring vehicles to you. And again, this is and sort of can't put this plainly enough. A car company described it to me as it's like showing up to Australia, it's showing up to a country that hasn't built roads yet, right? Every other country in the world, bar Australia and Russia, a developed country in the world, bar Australia and Russia, have these standards in place. When you show up to one country that does not, that's a very clear red flag that says, well, why should I be bringing my latest and best technology here? The business case doesn't stack up. And also on top of the business case, on top of what's in the, the numbers in the Excel spreadsheet, it's also just this, the vibe is off. Why aren't you guys doing what everyone else is doing?
I think what was interesting for me was to learn actually that the Productivity Commission actually presented recommendations to this very government in 2016, where they actually recommended that the government should move towards vehicle and fuel emission standards as quickly as they could, not only because it would be a better outcome for our climate and for our environment, but importantly because it would actually reduce cost of living expenses for every Australian by at least $500. Now, that advice from the Productivity Commission was ignored and has continued to be ignored. And very recently, we've seen that the current government has come out and said they actually have no intentions of addressing it until 2027. Is that all correct in what I've said?
Yeah, so a few things happened. There's sort of no shortage of discussion papers that have come out of this government for the last decade. The Productivity Commission said this, then the ministers led their own ministerial forum to double check those numbers, and they found the same thing. Their findings were that introducing a fuel efficiency standard in line with the United States, which is already one of the weaker standards, but even in line with them, would save the average motorist between $500 to $666 per year in fuel costs. It would save the Australian economy around $29 billion up to 2030 by not sending so much money overseas in order to buy fuel in the first place. And it'd save us about 31 million tonnes of CO2. It'd cut about 31 million tonnes of CO2 by 2030 as well. Unfortunately, that last bit was included in the report, and that's why we don't have one right now. This issue got politicised. It got called a carbon tax on cars, and it got told, it became a greening issue rather than just a common sense issue. And rather than being seen as a benefit, it got seen as a reason not to act. And as a result, here we are today. And we're talking about this thing, and I would caution people to look at this each time when we talk about electric vehicles. If you've only seen electric vehicles in the Australian market, you have a certain idea in your mind. This is not what the market looks like in the rest of the world. And this is a really good illustration of this. The government themselves started investigating this issue in 2016. That doesn't mean that this policy is a 2016 policy. The United States introduced this policy in 1976. So we're already some good 50 years behind the mark, and we're still not doing it.
Wow, I hadn't heard that before, but that's quite terrifying. On the back of having learned that, though, and I thank you because you have been part of educating me, all three people here on the panel have provided me with advice and insight, so thank you so much. But one of the commitments I've made as the potential independent for North Sydney is if I am elected as the representative, I will table a private member's bill in the House of Representatives within the first 12 months, pushing for that vehicle and fuel emission standards to actually be legislated in Australia. So we take it out of the hands of the minister. At the moment it is by ministerial discretion, and we actually get it into legislation so that we have sent that very clear message to the market, both domestically and internationally, that we are serious about this. By passing that legislation, we draw a line in the sand for ourselves as a nation, and we start to move our country forward. There are 4 members on the crossbench at the moment, and those 4 members have batted way above their weight in the last 3 years. They've arguably pushed the issues around climate action, integrity in politics, gambling responsibility and recently the reforms in the religious discrimination bill, with 3 more independents on the crossbench, so 7 in total, we actually become a significant force for driving positive discussions back into the House of Representatives where all Australians can hear them actually discussed. Gabrielle, I want to move to you because I think what is interesting is that in almost every discussion around EVs in Australia, we focus very much on the vehicles themselves as an instrument to help people move around. But the reality is there's so much more potential behind this technology, and I think it's an important one to discuss because it fundamentally begins to address that question of how do we move to a sustainable and renewable economy, and what is the role of electric vehicles in helping us achieve that?
Thanks for the invitation to be here, Kylie, and thanks for the question. My job here this afternoon is to change your view of what an electric vehicle is. And I know there are some people in the room who will remember what a landline is. There are probably some people that are too young to know what one of those is. But the difference between a landline and a mobile phone is very much like the difference between a fossil fuel powered vehicle and an electric vehicle. And that's for 2 reasons. One, there's a lot more smarts in an electric vehicle, and the other one is they're both highly dependent on their batteries. We think of a vehicle just as something that you drive around. An electric vehicle has 6 to 10 times the capacity of a Powerwall or household battery. So it's really a battery on wheels with a hell of a lot of smarts embedded in it at the same time. And I'm glad we started with the question about electric vehicle charging, and Behyad's already talked about the fact that most of our cars are stationary most of the time. And so that means that whenever they're stationary, they can be used as a resource in the electricity grid. So if you buy an electric vehicle, just as the same as if anyone here has put a solar system on their roof, you're actually contributing part of the electricity infrastructure of the future. People here may or may not know that not only is Australia the home of solar panel technology, we've had world-leading breaking record solar technology, particularly come out of the University of New South Wales, right here in Sydney. But now Australia has more solar panels per person than any other country on Earth. So for anyone who says, oh, we can't do renewables, it's too hard, it's too expensive, there are 3 million households around Australia that have already done it. So it's imminently possible. Plus, solar panels and electric vehicles are the perfect partners. So if you can put the solar where the vehicles will charge, or you can provide other batteries that are charged from the solar and then can charge the EVs, then you get the perfect combination, because we know what the refrain is. What's going to happen when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine? These people who are asking those questions clearly haven't heard of batteries. And the good news is that the battery technology is improving all the time and the costs are declining all the time. So obviously solar panel costs have fallen dramatically and battery costs are falling almost as fast. The number that's used as a learning rate of 17%. Now there are supply chain challenges, but it's also a huge opportunity for Australia because we have a lot of lithium, and that's a core component of most of the batteries that you see in EVs right now. The other thing I wanted to mention right at the beginning is the idea of killing the weekend, and the 3 ways in which your EV can be used to interact with the grid. So there's 3 different acronyms. So there's V to L, which is vehicle to load. So that's the idea that you can have a plug in the back of your ute, and you might plug in your electric tools to charge. If you're a tradie out on site, you might use it as a substitute for having a diesel generator on a building site, for example. Or if you're family on a camping trip, you might take your toaster and plug it in and be making toast off the back of your ute. So that's vehicle to load. Then there's V to H, which is just your vehicle feeding back into your home. So as an example of scale, depending on how efficient your house is, you could power your house overnight 2, 3, 4 nights charging it solar during the day. You could go for a very long time. And so that managed charging back into homes or businesses is important. And then the third one, and this will take the longest amount of time, but it's really important for the grid, is vehicle to grid, V2G. And so Alex was in charge of the best plan that we have. People think we don't have a plan for transitioning the electricity sector in Australia. We have a thing called the Integrated System Plan. If you want to get into the technical detail, it's worth having a look because it shows how we can get out of coal and gas in the electricity sector. And it shows that by 2050, for all of the dispatchable capacity, so that's the on-demand electricity that we want to have available if there's changes in the weather, 3/4 of that will be behind the meter, that is in people's homes and businesses. And a lot of that will be these EVs. We'll have household batteries, we'll have batteries in our businesses, we'll have all of these mobile batteries, and we'll obviously have large-scale batteries in the grid as well.
I love that analogy of like the old-fashioned phone. I mean, I actually, growing up out in Kuiper, when I used to call my nan, I used to have to go through an exchange, and the lady on the exchange, her name was actually Beryl, and you would dial, my nan's number was #8, and you'd get put through to the exchange, and Beryl would often go, no, Kylie, sorry, your nan's down at the golf club, she's playing with, so give her a few minutes and, or I can put you through the club later or whatever. So to think we've actually gone, in my lifetime, we've gone from exchanges through to dial direct lines, through to early mobile phones, to today. I have, I don't know if I said this, I have 3 teenagers. I have a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old. I actually don't think they think of this as a phone. That's actually not what they see it as. And it's so exciting to consider that opportunity for our vehicles. I want to just touch on a little bit about what you said there, and it relates to actually the significant resource that we have here in our own boundaries. You mentioned lithium. I actually, Behyad taught me that 50% of the lithium in car batteries right around the world comes out of the ground here in Australia. What might interest some of you to know is that we offshore that. So when we ship that offshore, it's worth about 130 million, and please, you guys know to correct me, $130 million as we sell it offshore. We ship it to markets where it's then refined and turned into ready-use batteries. They sell it on for $2.7 billion. So somebody's getting a hell of a markup in that space. I want to kind of come back to you and say, I mean, these were opportunities that you looked at when you were working within the government. What has stopped this from proceeding other than lack of political will? Are there other barriers that we just don't see?
It was called a gas-fired recovery. If anyone remembers that, it's a bit like the government is listening to the people who make landlines and asking them how to do the economic development of Australia. We actually have a serious number of proposals for greater gas exploration underway in Australia at the moment. Beetaloo Basin, Northwest Shelf, the Prime Minister is currently campaigning on gas. There's a proposal for a gas-fired power station that taxpayers will fund, cost of $600 million, I think is right, up in the Hunter. I don't, like, while it's good for a laugh, I'm quite serious about the fact that I think the people that have been advising the government are looking backwards, and it takes imagination to see the future, and it takes talking to people who understand what all of these future opportunities are, and I think they're dramatic, and I also think that they're needed. Over the last few years, some of you may know, we've developed an export gas industry out of Queensland. Now that's earning quite a lot of nice revenue at the moment, but as that ramps down, as it will inevitably, because the rest of the world is decarbonising, then we need to develop all of these clean exports, clean energy export industries to provide the revenue and the jobs of the future. We've got this amazing project that most of you probably have heard of, called the Sun Cable, which is exporting solar electricity out of the Northern Territory to Singapore. That is, when I first heard about it, I thought it's crazy, but it's visionary, and you never know, it might well happen. So we really need policy and a political will to make all of those things happen.
And Alex, I saw you pick up that microphone, so I'm just going to ask you to go for it. I know, you've been there, you've been on AEMO, you've been with CSR, IRO. Please tell us.
You know me too well, Kylie. I was just laughing when Gabrielle mentioned the gaslight recovery. It's actually quite interesting what happened in the electricity market just in the last quarter. So in the last quarter, electricity prices have increased by almost 70%. And the reason for that is because we are so reliant on fossil fuel prices, because gas prices went up, coal prices went up. And that's actually one of the key drivers. So if you really care about making electricity cheap, we need to become much, much smarter in actually using that modern technology, renewables, using all of the distributed batteries to actually keep our power prices low and frankly make them much more predictable.
That is the perfect way to start, because that was going to be my question to you, was that we hear frequently, so I had the opportunity to debate two of the other candidates for our seat on Sky on Thursday, and what I found was at points it did feel like it was 3 against 1, I've got to say. But what was particularly interesting was this absolute fixation and this desire from within the current system to continue to convince us that solar and renewable energies are going to cost our country so much, that actually vehicles are too expensive and they're going to cost too much. I mean, Alex, can you help? I mean, I've just heard you say, so energy prices in the last quarter have gone up by 70%. Because we're reliant on fossil fuels. Can you pick up on what I'm saying here to talk about this expense model?
Yeah, that probably comes back to the integrated system plan that I think Gabrielle also mentioned. I mean, we spend 2 years consulting as widely as you can with well over 100 organisations across Australia to get really an understanding of what's the current state of technology, what does technology cost, and where does it go into the future? And then we basically asked the very simple question, what is the least cost way to transition the system? Because as a matter of fact, coal-fired power stations are old. They're exiting the market, and frankly, they're exiting faster than we even anticipated. I mean, Araring Power Station, New South Wales, just announced that they're going to close in 2025. And then you will remember, Mike Cannon Brooks and Brookfield bid for AGL, and they wanted to take all of their power stations out before the end of this decade. So this has happened really, really quickly. So how do you replace it? Well, you replace it with renewables, and then you need storage and firming power. And this is actually where electric vehicles can be really powerful. Just to build on the example that Gabrielle provided, in the projection in the integrated system plan, and sadly we are not getting higher EV uptake rates, but we were projecting maybe 20% of vehicles by 2030 might be electric. With the large-scale battery that Gabrielle mentioned, that gives us the ability to power the whole state for 5 hours just on the electric vehicles that we're building.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Just on electric
it's
vehicles?
1.4 million vehicles times 10 kilowatt output, which by the way they can do more if you want to, and they have an average 50 kilowatt hours battery. So there's really a significantly reduced risk of blackouts if you use those vehicles properly. But that requires careful regulation, it requires the right infrastructure. It actually requires what Kieran did in the UK. We actually need to build charging stations where vehicles can then feed into the grid and be charged when power prices are negative. So that means you're actually getting paid if you're fueling your vehicle. Just think about that. You go to the petrol station and get paid to fill up your car. That's amazing.
Actually, I just saw
I'll pick up on that, just in terms of, Alex just talked about power prices being negative. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that, but we have so much solar in the middle of the day now that we're increasingly, the way the wholesale market works is if there's more generators wanting to put electricity into the system, then they have to pay to generate. So the prices go to negative $1,000 a megawatt hour. And we're seeing these negative price periods. In South Australia now, it's like a quarter of the time in the daytime or something.
It's on average negative prices. So you could just take a wire and run power through, and you get paid for it.
Yeah. So, which comes back to your question, Kylie, and why I want to pick up on it is, there's the running costs of coal and gas-fired power stations. Really, a lot of that comes down to the cost of the fuel, and sunshine and wind are free. And so the running costs are really low. So the fundamentals of the economics is that renewables are always going to be cheaper, and those costs keep on falling. And we have so much solar in the middle of the day now that's also providing the opportunity, if we chose to use it well, for a whole lot of manufacturing and intensive forms of electricity use, either to start up or to be shifted from other times into the middle of the day. And that's a huge economic opportunity that lots of overseas companies are looking to Australia for.
So I have a question. Where's the integrated systems plan up to then?
The final is going to come out at the end of June, and driving towards hopefully implementation.
You don't sound confident.
Look, I think we know the change that needs to happen. I think the biggest question is, how do we make this change happen faster? And how do we manage this change better? I think we all know what needs to be done. It's actually, we just need to get down and do it and remove the roadblocks.
So roadblocks. I think that's such a good thing to pick up at this point in time, because I hear what you're saying, and I look around the room and I see very intelligent, infinitely well-informed people who have obviously shown up today because they're interested in this topic. How can there possibly be roadblocks to something that seems to make so much sense? Is this state capture? I've heard this phrase, it's particularly become coined in this electoral period. What's going on? And why is it? The other thing I've heard, and I'd like to get comments from all three of you, is that the reality is that the only thing that is driving us forward on that renewable, sustainable opportunity is actually state and territory governments at the moment, and in fact the federal government is consistently the barrier for moving forward. So I don't know if that's a question, but there's a series of points to ask you to pick up on, please.
Well, can I just build on this and just provide a plug for New South Wales, because I'm actually currently doing some work for New South Wales, so I may be biased, but it is absolutely remarkable what the New South Wales government is currently doing in terms of implementing its energy roadmap. So they have set a target of building 12 gigawatts of renewables plus 2 gigawatts of dispatchable capacity, and build all of, which is actually quite difficult, all of the network structure that goes with it. And do you know why they want to do it? Because they have actually worked out it's cheaper for consumers, and that's why they're driving it hard.
So on that, one of the other main reasons I actually said yes to North Sydney's Independent when they approached me to run was I am furious about the gas power plant that's going to be established in Kurri. I mean, for me, that was the first time that I actually realised that our federal government was actually working against the state government. From your perspective, Alex, do we need a gas power plant in Kurri?
Well, what we do need is dispatchable capacity. And there are many different ways we can get dispatchable capacity. We talked a lot about EVs, clearly demonstrated they can provide dispatchable capacity. New South Wales government is also currently in the market of buying a big battery, 700 megawatts, 1400 megawatt hour capacity. So it's actually going to be even bigger than the battery that we just procured 2 years ago in Victoria. Yay, we did Victoria. We can build pumped hydro, and we can build gas. Now, which which one of those solutions is really future-proof, I ask you? And I think it's the modern solutions, it's the intelligent solutions that Gabrielle was referring to. I think that's what we need to focus on.
Probably, sorry, where was I going to go on that? There's an organisation called the International Energy Agency. It sits under the OECD. And for many years, a lot of people would have thought that it was an institution that was probably captured by the fossil fuel industry. It was very conservative. For a very long time, it was always taking the perspective that renewables were too expensive and they were too far off. Last year, the IEA came out saying, we've looked at the climate science and there can be no new development of coal, oil or gas from now. Not like in 5 years' time, not like, you know, maybe some development around the edges, none. Like, we cannot be developing gas, and obviously a new gas-fired power station would use gas. So that's inconsistent with the climate science. It would also be a lot more expensive. And I think, especially because it would take several years to get up and running, that by the time it was built, it would be even more expensive than what we think of compared to the alternatives now.
Yeah, if I can just go back to the original question, rather than talking about gas-fired power, and Alex pointed this out, I just want to repeat this, we do scorecards right around the country of which states and which government in the country is doing the best when it comes to electric vehicles, and by quite a distance at the moment, New South Wales comes first. And you look at the things that they have done and what it takes, whether we talk about clean energy or a clean energy technology like electric vehicles, it takes standards, it takes targets, and it takes incentives. You put those three things together, you've got yourself a plan and you start accelerating uptake. Now, being a state government, they've had to do their own version of that. They've got the incentives, they've got an ambitious target, so they're aiming for 50% of new vehicle sales to be electric by 2030. Haven't been able to legislate that yet. And in place of standards, there's a constitutional issue with state governments introducing these standards. They've been trying to do other market mechanisms and also encouraging the federal government to act on this. Now, we're here at a candidates forum, worth noting they're a coalition government and they got on with it. We heard from Kieran about what's going on in the UK, all of the really great work that they've been doing, and they were one of the leading countries in the EU that dragged a lot of the rest of the EU along on electric vehicles. That was a Conservative government that was doing it there as well. In a lot of this does not need to be a partisan issue. Unfortunately, it is one here. And I think that speaks a lot more to, rather than politics, it speaks a lot more to competence in government. And that's the unfortunate reality that we've got here. And I'm someone who does spend a lot of time talking to ministers in the federal government, and it is frankly a conversation of, come sit down and let me tell you how this needs to work. You're getting an hour with the representative of an industry or other leaders within an industry, and I'm going to talk at you rather than hear from you what actually needs to happen in this space. When you try explaining, well, your approach has us as one of the world's losers in electric vehicles, that's not heard. And I think this does, as I say, to me it is about confidence, but also really intention, right? It's a government that doesn't want to be leading in some of these things, and they're getting the outcome that they want.
It really resonates what you just said, Behyad, to me, around the number of people that have said that we have a political system that's no longer listening. And I think it's really interestingly, I think we've entered kind of a weird stage in our country where politicians seem to want to be able to present themselves as the experts and everything. And I was looking back on, so for 35 years, as I said, I've been an advocate, so I've worked around the federal government area for most of my professional life. And I was looking back on the way that the relationship between people, between the way that people who want to work with the government itself works. And when I first started working with the government around the McGrath Foundation, for example, the process of building that program, which has gone on to be incredibly sustainable, involved the health department, it involved the medical services around the country, and it involved the minister, and then it involved ourselves as a community group. More and more I'm hearing this phrase, ministerial discretion, and the fact that the departments are being told they don't want to be listened to, they don't, they're not required to be heard. It's really struck me that there's fundamentally, that the point you just said, they don't
You don't go to talk to them to be heard, you go to be talked at. And that actually came up in the debate on Sky on Thursday, where one of the candidates came out and said, for God's sake, we don't need to talk anymore. And I was like, well, we're not talking. That's the whole problem. There's a question that has been lingering in my head and I've just lost it, but it comes back to that. So I got nailed on Thursday by the compere. I'm happy to own this. When she started asking me, how are we going to pay? Like, the fuel excise is a massive part of the Australian budget. And we've just seen the government has reduced it by 50%, quite conveniently, for 6 months leading into a federal election. But I'm not cynical about that at all. But the compere seemed to be determined to then nail me on, so if you're not doing that, how are electric vehicles going to pay? How will road users pay? In my head, sitting in the seat of North Sydney, I said odometer, because that makes sense to me. But I did grow up out in Kuiper, and if it was odometer, quite frankly, I'd be back on my horse, so going places. Help me understand, how do people pay? I mean, to your point, sun and wind is free. How will we fill that gap that is the fuel excise as we move away from fossil fuels?
Yeah, let me give you a couple of points there, because we often start with the idea that things are good enough and all these changes that we're talking about are going to cost us a lot of money. So why don't we just look at where fuel security is for us right now in Australia? In the last 12 months alone, the federal government spent close to $6 billion in order to plug a gap in fuel security. That's gone to oil refineries to keep them open for a little bit longer. It's gone to the $3 billion for a fuel excise discount because petrol prices have gone up, which has not hit the sides, and petrol prices have continued to go up. And we've seen, again, another grants throughout this election campaign given to oil refineries in order to help them make them a little bit more profitable so that they don't close, and they are eventually going to close in Australia. So that $6 billion, none of that is a long-term plan. That just says that next time that there's an issue, we're going to be up for that money again. We're going to have to pay another $5-6 million in order to keep going. And that's what we criticise the government for. Where is the rest of this plan? So then when it comes to, well, let's say we are successful and we do move across, and how do we start replacing these charges? Nor is that new. We have to remember we're actually world losers in this. We're laggards. So it's not like nobody else has come across this issue before. And in fact, even, again, the federal government, I think it was 2010 that the Henry Tax Review came up with options for how we replace fuel excise. Wow. So three-pronged approach of there is a distance charge associated to it, but that's actually the least interesting part of this. The other two components are also providing a charge for emissions for vehicles, as well as a charge for congestion. And this gets to the point that you're making of paying for our roads. The idea of it doesn't cost as much if you're driving around Canberra. It costs a lot if you're driving in peak hour in North Sydney or in the city. And what you really want to be doing there isn't just raising more money for the government, it's saying, can you instead get on a bus or a train? And if you do that, then it doesn't cost us as much in the first place. We're actually able to be more efficient, and we're able to get you to make a more sensible decision as well. If you need to drive, that's fine, but you're going to have to pay for the privilege too. So the systems are in place, and they've been in place for a very long time. The problem is we haven't begun that process of transitioning over to the new technology yet. So we don't get to come up with the solutions of now what do we do about the new technology that we've helped encourage.
Yeah. Actually, I want the microphone to go to Gabrielle, because I was going to say, if we're talking about getting people on buses and trains and active transport, I know that this is a passion area of yours. Would you like to talk a little bit about looking at transport as a holistic system?
Obviously, we could make all of our vehicles electric tomorrow, and that would have a huge health benefit in terms of local air pollution. It wouldn't solve the biggest health problem which comes from motor vehicles and the way that our cities are planned, which is the fact that the vast majority of us are living lives which are far too sedentary for ourselves. So we have Australia-wide problems with diabetes, obesity, heart disease, anxiety, depression. It's mental health and physical health issues because we've built car-dependent cities, and so there's still a huge. People have been talking about this for well over 50 years. There's still an enormous amount that needs to be done to encourage people to walk or cycle more. Electric bikes, I think, are making cycling viable for people with disabilities or with other health issues that might not be able to cycle. So there's a great opportunity there for governments to build cycling facilities that can be used by bicycles and e-bikes and scooters and all the rest. Walking and public transport has to be all part of this mix. But it's not just providing the transport, it's actually planning our cities better. I mean, it's really unfortunate the whole northwest sector of Sydney developed without a public transport spine and then had to be retrofitted, which I think also goes to the point about, there's often so much opportunity cost if you delay, and these things can be cheaper if we plan them well in advance. I just wanted to touch on the last question, because you talked about, how we're going to pay for roads and the transition. Last week, Ampol announced their first electric vehicle charging stations. So you've got a petrol company, a company that runs service stations, is starting to transition to EVs, and we've got a federal government that's currently in denial about it. So I think that gives you a sense of how far behind we are thinking about this. Obviously, walking, cycling, public transport, integrated transport and land use planning is primarily a state issue, but that's not to say that we couldn't have particularly a lot more federal funding going into that. There's a tiny amount of federal funding going into cycling at the moment, for example.
I should say Ampol is only one of the petrol station companies that are members of the Electric Vehicle Council, so watch this space. That's very exciting. But I think what Gabrielle's getting to as well is the more fundamental point to the question that you were asked, Kylie, of our roads cost so much to build and maintain because everyone's driving cars, so how do we keep paying for roads so that everyone can keep driving cars? And you go, well, actually, hang on, what's the thing that we're solving for here?
Yeah, what's the right question to
Well, that's
ask?
right.
Yeah.
It's, ultimately electric or petrol or anything else, cars are about essentially access, right? Whether it's access to one another, access to society, access to goods, services, products. How do we do those things is the answer to the question here. And of course, there's a what's the word I'm looking for? An unvirtuous cycle attached to this as well, right? Of we just keep building more roads and then more people continue using them and then the costs continue going up and we wonder, well, how can we continue to pay for this?
Sorry, I'm holding this because I'm about to give this to Jess for questions. But it sounds a little bit like, has anyone here watched the movie Don't Look Up on SBS recently? That sounds very much like a Don't Look Up scenario to me. Alex, before we go to the floor, and this is the last question from myself, so please, if you have a question, be prepared to go. This may be one you can help me answer, but my question is, with so much lithium coming out of the ground here in Australia and so many of the critical minerals that we need being here and prevalent in Australia, why aren't we manufacturing batteries here in Australia?
Well, I think because we are not having a very strong domestic market, we are a bit late to the game, but we have all of the ingredients to build actually a massive industry here. And this is way beyond just building batteries. I think we were talking about lithium and spodumene exports and that we're not doing value-added industries, but we actually need to think about this as a whole value chain. I mean, at the moment, the oil and gas industry, it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. That industry will disappear in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Gone. And it needs to be replaced by a new industry. And I think what we need to ensure is that Australia is actually at the forefront of that. And we are in such a good starting position. And it's actually a beautiful story. We are already in this game. So, in Australia, there is a global solar car race. It's called the World Solar Challenge. All the best engineers from across the world come together to basically drive their solar vehicles across the whole continent. If you can cross Australia, I mean, you would know this, you can basically do anything. And in 1999, there was a team of 3 engineers that made the 3rd place and then decided to start an electric vehicle charging company. That company is called Tritium. They did the hard startup slog for about 15 years and then their business really took off. And today we have the world's second largest manufacturer of electric vehicle chargers on planet Earth that started in a shed in Australia, serving the whole market. And here comes the best bit. Guess who's recently announced that they start a factory? President Joe Biden in the US, and they're building a factory in Tennessee. So my question is, why are we not building a factory here in Australia?
My answer is because we don't have a strong crossbench in the House of Representatives. Okay, so I just want to say thank you. I think I could sit here and talk to you guys all afternoon quite seriously, and I just want to come back to the point that I made at the start of today's forum. These are the minds that we have immediately in our community here in North Sydney. And yet the North Sydney vote in the last 3 years in federal politics was consistently used to block developments in this area. It was used to block debate around the climate bills, that was used to block debate around the Integrity Commission. It was used to block the referral of Christian Porter to the Privileges Committee. That's our vote, guys. That's our electoral vote. And that's how it's being cast. Regardless of how nice our current member is, the reality is that they are towing party lines and the parties are on their own bus, heading in their own direction. Now, what I would like to do is actually open the floor to questions. So Susie is going to be the mic runner by the look of it. So if you've got a question, please go for it. And these are going to be for you, not me.
Got a question for each of the panellists. The EV Council is implacably opposed, or has been so far, to any of the discussion where the states have looked at saying, how are they going to tackle road charges on EVs? They're implacably opposed to it. So when Kylie got nailed the other day, she should have had you there to create a smokescreen, because you didn't answer her question. And I'm from Wellington, just up the road, or down the road from Canberra, and we use odometers too. Alex, the integrated system plan is an essential part of restoring or putting in security and resiliency in the network system to ensure that when the lights need to stay on somewhere, that the renewable energy, very renewable energy that's somewhere, can get to somewhere else. And that's something that the existing transmission system doesn't require. It's all about being, here it is, there it comes, here it's used. So the ISP has taken extraordinary lengths to actually address that and being able to put in a network that does it. But that flies in the face of how networks are being paid for, which is exclusively in a state. So I've been quite involved in the ISP process, and in the ESP systems, the AEMO webinars, and in the AEMC webinars, everyone dodged the bullet of how we're supposed to pay for the ISP or for that transmission. Because at the moment, with all the increasing DER that people are getting, despite their desperate need, the same as everybody else, if you've got solar on your roof, the sun still goes down and the wind stops to blow and the rain comes and all those things. Everyone needs security and resiliency. But at the moment, people aren't asking that hard question. And Gabrielle, for you, for you, everybody does not trust their energy retailer. Is there anyone in the room here that trusts their energy retailer? Feel free to raise your hand. So I'm with you 100% on vehicle to grid vehicle. You know this, we chat. But how do we get to the point that all those batteries are there that will be able to be a resource and people will use it? What do we need to do, and what's wrong in our energy system with retailers or otherwise and things that needs to be fixed to help us?
Why don't I start? We'll take that in order if you don't mind. So, and if I encourage people, please introduce yourselves when you ask a question. Tim. Yeah, thanks a lot, Tim. So if we sort of take you back, you asked me about road user charges, and you're right. When Victoria announced their road user charges, I was very publicly opposed and led a pretty public campaign opposing their road user charge scheme, When New South Wales introduced theirs, I stood beside the Treasurer and supported him and helped him announce that plan. So
That he wasn't going to charge again.
that he wasn't going to charge yet. Yeah. So there's where we get into, well, why the two different responses, right? What we saw in Victoria was not a reform. It was saying we're immediately going to start charging electric vehicles more in order to drive on our roads. And at the time, there was nothing else attached to that, just the new tax to come. We'd been working with the Victorian government for quite a while on their electric vehicle policy. It wasn't out yet. There was no plan about how to support electric vehicles yet. They ended up releasing some bits and pieces of that as we were opposing them throughout that time. What New South Wales did instead, and this gets to the point I was making before about the Henry Tax Review did actually look into this and what are the good ways of doing it, and it also fits into what our roadmap is of saying we're going to spend between now and 2027 helping get more electric vehicles on the road. We're going to do that through a whole range of things like funding for charging infrastructure, $3,000 grants for people to buy electric vehicles, and we're getting rid of stamp duty. And there's a really, electric vehicles or not, there's a really neat thing, right, where Australians in general have very old vehicles which are less efficient and less safe. Every time you want to buy a car, you have to pay a few $1,000s more in stamp duty. It stops people from swapping their cars. And again, that's not just electric vehicles, that's for everything. And so, and a few other jurisdictions are now looking at models like this for both stamp duty and registration of saying, we're going to get rid of that and we're going to replace it in 2027 with a road usage charge, with a cents per kilometre charge. And that part of it is also quite neat, right? You always want this from governments of introduce something new and get rid of something old, but it's also a lot more efficient because it says to the driver, well, if I drive less, I'm actually saving money. I'm either going to pay as much cents per kilometre over a few years as I would in stamp duty, or I'm not, because I'm going to choose not to drive sometimes as well. And this is getting to that, road user charges are meant to be a reform, and that's not what we saw in Victoria. And why, I think some people criticised me at the time saying, well, why weren't you more constructive with the Treasurer? Believe me, we tried. That by the time I was being publicly opposed, that, the back had broken, essentially. That's why we were being publicly opposed.
So we have quite a range of questions there, Tim. To the question of who should pay for transmission, I think the fundamental truth is, as consumers, ultimately we will have to pay for our energy. And therefore, I think we need to make sure we design the energy system that basically is the least cost energy system that we can build in this country. And as you know from your engagement with the ISP process, we've really tried hard to identify what is that, and that's, as we've said, combination of renewables, dispatchable capacity, and then targeted transmission expansion to replace the existing infrastructure that's just aged and exiting and maybe that we want to get rid of anyway because we care about the climate. Transmission is actually a relatively small component of the overall total bill that we have to pay as a nation. So just to give everyone a feel, over the next 20 to 30 years, whether we like it or not, we have to invest about $100 billion into our energy system to transform it, and about $20 billion in transmission. And at the moment, the way it's paid for, to answer your question, consumers basically pay for this as regulated assets. There are probably better models to, get maybe generators to pay a little bit more, but let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. I think the really important thing is let's build the infrastructure that we need, because if we don't, we are actually facing a situation where consumers really pay through the nose. We actually just had one of those situations. Origin Energy, just a couple of weeks ago, announced they're going to close the Eraring power station early. That put New South Wales and the national electricity.
Or maybe take the
Running out of power, yeah, clearly. Put everyone into a really difficult situation, because if that power station goes out and we haven't built the replacement capacity, well, guess what? Consumers will pay scarcity pricing for electricity, and that is very, very expensive. So I think to answer your questions, yes, I think we as consumers need to be smart. We need to invest into the future to build the infrastructure that we need, and I think that will, in the long run, see us be better off.
Just a recap.
Hang on, wait on.
I just want to just correct this, but my point was more, Alex, about the fact that we can't get charged volumetrically, so we can avoid charges, and
and the transmission, we all need the benefit from it and driving it towards it. My point was, as a community, we've got to understand if we've got DER or we haven't, what should we still pay? And the transmission changes are for everybody. And I was just trying to draw that part of the question out. Sorry.
Yep.
Okay. Tim, in terms of your question about retailers and the lack of trust, I think there's multiple answers. One is consumers might not trust their retailers, but we've all got to have one if we want supply. So, you know, while surveys show time and time again, you know, the energy retailers are less trusted than banks, you know, people are not inclined to shift because they've got better things to do with their time and their money. That said, we have seen a lot of new entrants. The concentration, it used to be the big three had like 90% of the New South Wales market. That number's down more like 60-something, 65% I think at the moment. And also in terms of charging EVs and the control of all of your electricity use behind the meter, and I haven't really had the chance to talk about it, but there's lots of opportunities for demand response, in particular through household air conditioners, having your hot water to be able to be controlled. There's lots of flexible demand in the system that we really need to make the most of that we're not doing at the moment. That would also lower the costs. And so there'll be a lot of, and we're already seeing innovative third parties come in and be able to provide hopefully better services to consumers that do all of those things, as well as providing electricity. And to just one other point, because it goes to the question of how much is all of this going to cost. If consumers invest their own money in solar systems, as I said at the beginning, that's part of our electricity infrastructure. And so we need to be able to leverage all of those private investments, currently running at over $15 billion for 3 million households with solar, without counting commercial and industrial rooftop solar or battery storage or anything else. We're talking about billions of dollars of private investment. People obviously get a private benefit for that, but that can be leveraged for the benefit of everyone. And the worst possible situation on all of this would be for households in Sydney that can afford it to go off grid and leaving everyone else to pay for the distribution and the transmission costs. Now, stopping that happening is going to take a lot of smarts and good planning.
Great. Another question? Over here, Susie. Oh, no, I think it's... Oh, no, the gentleman in front of you, Susie.
Hi, my name is Amon. I work at the Energy Corporation for New South Wales, developing New South Wales RESs, as we call them. I have a question for Dr. Gabrielle on distributed energy resources. So, as Alex is quite aware, we're working really hard to develop transmission and big battery and storage and all that. Another piece of the puzzle is DER. Recently, Saul Griffith, an engineer who was in the US, came back to Australia and laid out in a book called The Big Switch, basically his plan for electrifying everything in Australia. As a young person and someone who living in a flat, I would like to ask you which policies can be designed to basically include people like me also in the part of being part of the distributed energy resources. So, basically having rooftop, charging an EV and having batteries. Because I feel like there's a lot of focus obviously on, people who own their own homes, but yeah, what about, who's in a flat and who has to do with strata and still a renter, so yeah.
That's an absolutely fantastic question, especially because we assume that we're talking about, solar on a single family dwelling and that they've got a garage where they can charge an EV. But we're going to need apartments to be part of electrifying everything as well. It's been a long time coming, but there now is a company called Illume that is working with apartment buildings, helping them put solar on the roof. They've developed a way of doing the metering such that you can distribute the solar, if you like, at least in terms of the billing to the different apartments. People can pay to own part of the system. Obviously, in a lot of apartment buildings, you'll only have enough solar on the roof, say, to run the lifts and or a pool and all the joint services for the building, but that's not to say it's not worth doing. The other point I'd make, particularly to your point about EV charging in apartment buildings, is this is where state government planning provisions are absolutely critical. The New South Wales government had a proposed state environmental planning policy that was going to require a certain proportion of EV charging and to have EV ready charging, by which they meant basically having the electrical conduit in the basements or where the car parking was in the buildings. I think we need to put that in such that all new buildings have to have all EV ready, at least charging for all of the parking spaces, because all the cars are going to be EVs in future. Unfortunately, in New South Wales, the new planning minister, Anthony Roberts, just killed that state environmental planning policy. So that's a little bit unfortunate. But you would hope that if we had, good state and federal government policy, we can also support retrofitting. And I'll finish on one last point, because I think it's really important, is that there are, of course, equity dimensions to all of this as well. So most of the houses and apartments that we have in Australia have a thermal comfort of 1.5 stars, which basically means they're like a tent. And in Germany, you can get a subsidised loan of up to €50,000 to bring your home up to, it's KfW, their development bank, so equivalent of our Clean Energy Finance Corporation, if you like, to their housing efficiency standard. So for low-income households, we need to do three things. One, we need to improve the thermal comfort. Two, we need to get them off gas, because it's not healthy. It's not good to have a gas mains coming into your house. And we need to get solar on the roofs of those buildings. And for all of those households, government needs to pay for that. But that will improve the household's health, and it will decrease their bills. And all of that is a matter of urgency.
Now, can I just check on time? So, Jess?
We have about 5 minutes left for questions. One more, I think.
Okay, so we've got three dueling hands. So let's go over here, Susie, and we'll go rapid fire. Okay, so it's like blind dates, bang, bang, bang. Let's do a rapid fire.
Check, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Yeah.
Quickly comment, Kylie, you blitzed the ambush the other day on Sky News. It was how it ended, it was brilliant. You left them in your dust. Secondly, I'm a scientist, but I'm not an energy scientist, I'm a wine scientist. I'm about to retire in a month's time and I lose my company car. I will be buying an electric car. You sold me, it's brilliant, thank you very much. Just quickly returning to the fuel efficiency before, we talked about the fact that in the OECD countries, we're the only one that hasn't got the fuel efficiency emissions standards, and I hear that there are car companies with great petrol cars that can't bring them to Australia because our fuel is really dirty. The comment, and I just need to understand this very simply, you say that if we have better standards, everyone saves $500. Is that simply because our cars will be more efficient? Is that what it is?
That's exactly what it is. So that's what fuel efficiency means. They use less fuel to do the same thing. And importantly, so when I say this applies to every other country, places like the US, people drive monster trucks on the roads. Doesn't mean you have to drive a smaller car. If you drive a ute, the ute would use less petrol to do the exact same job. What this piece of legislation does is it says the car company has to dip into their profits to make these cars more efficient, right? And
thank you.
Why this isn't happening anyway? Okay, I'll stop.
I'll be quick, Paul's my name. It seems like one of the biggest barriers to this is people's fear of being able to refuel, like I can't get to Byron Bay, I can't get to the snow, etc. But we've got one of the most sophisticated fueling networks out there, and people are used to to fueling their car via the petrol stations. If you took 15% of cars off the road, that's their profit margin. They don't make any money, so they don't want to lose that. So it's interesting that Ampol now are doing this with the electric charging stations. So what's your thoughts around, rather than everyone trying to go to the government and push it that way, but get these big corporations to be pushing it as well, because it's in their interest. They've got this most sophisticated retail network out there that they don't want to lose. And if it closes down, you can't use the sites for 20 years anyway. So what about if you turn it on the head and imagine a fuel company, big ad, do your bit for the country, buy an electric car, bought to you by Shell, BP and Ampol. Right? It changes the paradigm, and it changes the way that you need to promote this. It takes the whole argument if you can't get around the country.
Yeah, so to be very clear, when we talk about the role that the government has to play, in Australia especially, it is really the industry that's driving a lot of this. And even when the government does their job, that'll still be the case, right? When we talk about the government's role is sort of helping that first 5% shift, and then 95% of the work becomes about the private sector. Why we bemoan a lot here about what the government's not doing is because you've got consumers who are very interested, the industry that's doing its bit, and then that last seat on the table is empty. And that's why we spend a lot of time talking about it, because it's not happening. If it did, we'd be talking a lot more about what else can we as an industry do to continue riding this momentum.
Yeah, and actually that was going to be the piece I was going to add is Paul, I actually think industry is moving, and we're seeing extraordinary moves, particularly in the commercial sector. We look at Michael Cannon-Brookes trying to do it. I hear consistently, the thing I hear consistently when I say to people, what does the federal government need to be doing in this space, is get out of the way. They're actually actively stopping this from happening. So come to the seat, sit in the seat and play a really active and positive role, and that's what I'd be pushing for. Now we have one more question.
Rob Coles. I've recently looked at purchasing an EV and talking to Kia and Tesla, asked them about vehicle to the house, vehicle to the grid, and was told, no, we can't do it. And of course the Tesla man said, we make batteries. The second comment is in regard to bi-directional charging. I saw an article in the paper that said it's $10,000 for a bi-directional home charger, and there's only just one being released in Australia, so therefore a cost there. The third comment is basically a comment about that I'm told that 30% of all the traffic in Sydney is parents taking their kids to and from school. So maybe a question as far as Kylea is concerned, a way of changing that so that we actually get less parents taking their children to school, or a better way to do it, and therefore we would improve all of the aspects of our current transport problems.
You go. No, you go.
I thought you might jump in, and Kylea did ask me if I had an EV, and I've never owned a motor vehicle. Unfortunate also not to have children to have to drive them to school, but it goes to that point about integrated transport and land use planning, and we've suffered so much in ways that we don't understand by creating car-dependent cities. So it's possible to turn it around, but that also does mean that all of our focus on EVs needs to be balanced with the walking, cycling and public transport. Just quickly, the $10,000 charger was for vehicle to grid, not just bi-directional. So bi-directional's less costly. It will take time, but to get vehicle to grid up and running. But I actually talked to the Chief Technology Officer of Tritium at an event the other day, and he told me, and I hope this is not commercial in confidence, but he said...
Are they on the stock market? Can we just...
They're on the American stock market. So, he said that their next charger, so the second biggest vehicle charging company in the world, their next model, which comes out in 18 months, will have vehicle to grid as standard. So there's a whole lot of moves, and it's like everything in this space. it will happen far faster than anyone thinks is possible.
But is that possible even if the car companies don't want that to happen? That's what my other part of the question.
I think you mentioned that Tesla's cars don't have that capability at the moment. I think Kia's do. I certainly know Hyundai's do, and they share a platform, so they should be able to. So a few, the Leaf does, as you mentioned as well. A few vehicles do. In the next generation of vehicles, or the vehicles coming out, have these capabilities. Whether or not be equal to grid, certainly be equal to something. So either to load or to X. I think the key thing that we've been getting to a lot here is though. When we talk about we're at 2%, other countries are at 20%, we're already missing out on the stuff that is here now. And if we don't do something, the next thing that comes, we're going to miss out on that for too long, for a longer period of time too. So this is our chance to get on the right track so that as good new things come, Australia gets to access them, and Australian drivers get to access them as well.
I think we might be at time. I'm so sorry. So I have a couple of things just to end on. First, actually, if you are interested in hearing more about what's just happened with Anthony Roberts and the planning here about sustainability in our community, we are doing another forum tomorrow, actually, at the Wollstonecraft Club. I think it's, Jess, is it the same time?
Yes, 3 to 5 p.m.
3 till 5 p.m. tomorrow at the Wollstonecraft Club. We have an amazing lineup of speakers again coming. As with all of our events, it's free, and we would love to see as many people as possible there. So please jump online and check out the details of that if you would like to pursue that conversation, because I think much elements from today will roll over into tomorrow. This thing I wanted to end on, I guess, is the other, there are two commitments that I've made as an independent candidate for North Sydney. The first is that if sent to Canberra, I will argue for higher emissions reduction targets by 2030. So I will stand in behind the call for 60% legislated emissions reductions by 2030 at this stage. But then the second thing, and the reason I think this is so exciting, is that because of people like the three that you see sitting in front of you and 30 other people that have gathered around this campaign, we actually have put forward the proposal that the federal seat of North Sydney could be one of the first net zero urban energy zones in the country. The reason we can do that is because we do have some highly motivated, forward-thinking councils who are ready to work this way. We do have a state government that is very ready to work this way. And my commitment as the federal member for North Sydney is that I would work with both those levels of government to help push that through to become a reality for our community. Now that's important because it reduces our emissions, it reduces our cost of living, but actually I think one of the most exciting things about it is that if we can prove that it can be done and how quickly it can be done, if North Sydney can do it, anybody can do it. And actually Sol Griffith, who you talked about, is part of that planning process as North Sydney is one of the urban seats. So I think that probably brings us to time. So again, thank you to all of you for giving us your time today. The speakers are hanging around for a little while. Please join me with go. Please join me. And guys, please remember, it is not that we lack the solutions to the challenges that we face at the moment as a society. It's that we've lacked the political will. So we can change the climate in Canberra. There is value in North Sydney's voice being heard and in our vote being cast in a way which is consistent with our ambitions. And I would just leave us by saying, if not us, who? And if not now, when? Thank you, guys. Bye.
Hi everyone, my name's Anton Bikstrom. I'm one of the co-founders of the Good Car Company, and it's so heartening to see you all here together today, putting together climate action and community to make a real change. Before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. I'm standing on Bundjalung country and recognise that traditional owners around Australia have done a wonderful job at keeping our landscape sustainable, and we have a lot to learn from them. So who are we and what are we about? Have you heard the joke about 3 environmental scientists who walked into a bar and started a car company? Maybe not, but if you had, that joke would be about us. Myself, Sam Whitehead and Anthony Brosvan-Grenou, we started this company a few years ago because we wanted an electric car. We were going to do what's called a conversion, whereas you go to the shed and you build a car. You get the angle grinder and you've got batteries and soldering irons and all these things, and it was a little bit too hard for us. So at that point we started looking around for options, and some friends of us down the road had purchased an electric car themselves. They'd imported it, and that set us on a research pathway that led us to all places, New Zealand. And over there are tens of thousands of 100% electric cars which were buzzing quietly around the countryside without any fanfare, without any support or subsidies. And they'd done that because they'd gone overseas and found second-hand vehicles that were more affordable. And that gave us the aha moment. And that leads us to our number one customer, whose name is Rosie. She's our first customer, by the way. She, I think, is a lot like you in that she was extremely disappointed after the last election, and she and her partner wanted to take meaningful action. They're going to lead this transition through their wallet. That relationship led to us delivering Australia's first EV bulk buy, enabling 24 of my neighbours to stop their transport emissions. And now when I leave my house, I see half a dozen of our good cars. Each one is halting emissions and making our streets quieter and sweeter smelling. We've since enabled hundreds of households to make the switch to electric vehicles. But why are we doing this? And it's that little thing of the climate crisis and what's left of the decade to halve our emissions. So how do we as individuals or as communities or business or government solve this crisis? Unfortunately, there are 2 things available to us now, mature technologies that can be deployed at scale, and they are renewable energy and the electrification of transport. As a business, our vision is that everyone gets to decarbonise energy and transport. It took around a decade for solar to mainstream as a standard consumer item, but to meet the challenge we need to accelerate this transition with EVs and with renewable technology. The anti-renewable story is, oh, what do you do when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow? Well, we think the answer to this is plug in your car. Soon, every household will have around 3 days of their household's power consumption as battery storage sitting in their car, sitting in their driveway. Let's imagine that battery storage is deployable and what sort of future that will enable. We can have all of that storage distributed across our landscape, in our cities, in our towns, ready to go when the wind stops blowing or the sun stops shining. Cars we import currently have the capacity to run your house and feed back into the grid. We work with communities and organisations like you that are dragging us into the zero emissions future. It's why we partner with businesses like NRMA or new EV suppliers like Polestar and vehicle-to-grid technology companies to bring about this change. And it's why we're working on financial mechanisms that unlock this for lower income communities. With that said, there are a few key barriers to mass EV uptake, and they are charger availability, like vehicle range and range anxiety, model choice, and affordability. We can't solve all of them, but our approach is to solve a few of them very well. And the place we started was with affordability. So we import electric cars from other jurisdictions, and this started with a vehicle called the Nissan Leaf. And through this mechanism, we've effectively created a second-hand car market in Australia. We've been delivering cars from around $17,000 for a shorter range EV up to around the 50 grand mark. We do a heap of quality assurance, battery checks, and even attach a battery warranty to the car. And do a whole process that brings it from overseas to delivery in your local city or town. We also work with existing Australian-based EV suppliers such as Hyundai and Polestar and MG. With Hyundai, we've arranged a way of passing on government fleet pricing direct to customers, and that way we get to save the customer some money and people get the new car smell and new car warranty, which a lot of people are looking for. With Polestar, we're doing a similar thing, but with a more premium vehicle with a bunch of awesome features, including a great towing capacity, which a bunch of people are looking for. And when it comes to vehicle range, our model gets to bypass a bunch of the original OEMs because we can bring in vehicles from other locations. So we now have 2 electric vans which weren't available in Australia. One's a 7-seater people mover, and another one is a light commercial vehicle that's been manufactured by Peugeot. We can't wait to get an electric ute to Australia. So that's an introduction to the Good Car Company. As you can see, we're working so everyone can decarbonise transport and energy. It's about starting a conversation with hundreds of people like yourselves in the room. You are the champions who can continue this conversation with your family, your friends, and your colleagues. It's about showing leadership in times when action is both necessary and urgent, and it builds momentum to support brave policymakers and change the minds of naysayers. And it's about taking another step, one of many, towards a safe climate future. What I'm asking today is that you take more action on transport. So if it's swearing to ride scooters and catch the train, that's good. If it's living in a yurt and walking everywhere, that's good. If it's buying a Tesla, that's good. But if you are going to drive, we can drive electric, powered by sunshine, wind, and water. Thank you very much. Best of luck, and have a great day.
Authorised by Kylea Tink, North Sydney, New South Wales.